Hi, this is Campbell Price, Curator of Egypt and Sudan at Manchester Museum. I am not, I don't think, broadcasting on the right flipping thing. Not entirely sure, so I'm going to um, just continue broadcasting in this channel. It's not properly the little event that we set up. But nonetheless, it's a great pleasure to be here. Previous weeks, I have used Periscope, which is a great platform, but YouTube offers us a larger number of existing followers. So I hope people who previously have enjoyed Egyptology in lockdown with me, Campbell Price, have made the jump over to YouTube. A few questions this week. It's been 2 weeks since I last spoke to you. There were technical difficulties on the last Periscope, which was slightly frustrating. But I thought it would be useful to go back over some questions we had about ancient Egypt in popular culture, because that is something I'm asked a lot about, and it's something which I think there's a great general interest in. So I have been asked in the past what my favourite movie set in ancient Egypt is, or with an Egyptological theme. Honest answer, honest answer initially has to be Thundercats. That's not really a movie, although they did make spin-off movies about it. Honestly, Stargate 1994 is an interesting film, although it has somewhat problematic Orientalist tropes, which I might not be so comfortable with today. I would say, in terms of what is the most accurate, I've often been asked, what are the most accurate representations of ancient Egypt? And I would have to say, this Polish film from 1966, designed, the costumes, wonderfully designed by an Egyptian production designer called Shadi Abdul Salam. And really, there's something about it, although it's Polish people dressed up as ancient Egyptians, there's something about it which creates a kind of atmosphere that you think you really are in ancient Egypt. It's quite strange, quite slow, quite kind of ritualized, but it gives me the sense of being in ancient Egypt. Another personal favourite from the 1950s, starring Joan Collins and Jack Hawkins, was, of course, Land of the Pharaohs. Really camp, classic, based on, in fact, some real Egyptology and with Egyptological input from several scholars of the day in the 1950s. So I definitely recommend Land of the Pharaohs. That leads me to another question about how accurate recreations of ancient Egyptian speaking are. Now, we know how to understand hieroglyphs for the most part, but we have difficulty verbalizing them, vocalizing them, simply because we lack, for the most part, consonant signs or the consonant sounds in ancient Egyptian. Ancient Egyptian spoken language is preserved through Greek lettering into a language we now call Coptic, which is often used in the Coptic Church. Coptic Christianity uses this survival from ancient Egypt. And so in some films, like the Mummy franchise, 1999, there are recreations of how you sound out ancient Egyptian, based on information from hieroglyphic text, but also extrapolating information from Coptic. And so I was asked, what is the best, in lockdown, introduction to hieroglyphs? So I've been asked before, what is the best book to learn hieroglyphs? And I said the book I learned from was entitled How to Read Ancient Egyptian Hieroglyphs by Mark Collier and Bill Manley. That's very good for an advanced study. But if you want something that just introduces hieroglyphs, this book, reissued recently by a lady called Hilary Wilson, Egyptologist Hilary Wilson, is my absolute go-to because it is much more accessible. It's not about the grammar. I mean, I'm not any great shakes with grammar, but it's about recognizing signs and feeling good about yourself when you go into a museum. You see some ancient Egyptian texts on genuine objects. This is a first step in the direction of watching Egyptian objects, seeing Egyptian objects, and comprehending some of the sign groups. And there is such a feeling of satisfaction. I remember myself, before I went to university, using this book and getting that feeling of satisfaction, of achievement by recognizing certain signs, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, which occur together. So, best advice for initial steps in hieroglyphs would be this book by Hilary Wilson. I have been asked several times what, thinking about popular culture, thinking about Tutankhamun, people know the name Tutankhamun, the boy king who ruled in the 14th century BCE, whose tomb was discovered by an Egyptian worker working for an English archaeologist called Howard Carter, sponsored by an English aristocrat called Lord Carnarvon. Tutankhamun's tomb is one of the best known finds in Egyptian archaeology, full of fascinating, glitzy objects. The only almost intact royal tomb to survive from ancient Egypt, full of anything substantial still left in the tomb. I've been asked, on one hand, what is your favorite replica? There are a few in the shelf behind me. What is your favorite replica, Campbell? And what is your favorite replica from Tutankhamun's tomb? Now, as it happens, love a bit of Egyptology and popular culture, absolutely. Who doesn't? I especially did when I was a kid. But actually, I don't currently have in my home study, i.e. spare bedroom full of books, I don't have that much ephemera, actually. But one piece I do have, which I quite like for its aesthetically pleasing qualities, is this. This piece I bought from a Ministry of Antiquities run shop in Cairo, in downtown Cairo, a few years ago. So it's well made. It's a kind of an official reproduction, you might say, and it's very bright turquoise blue. This is a good replica. It's hollow of an object found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It's in the shape. Well, it's in the shape of several hieroglyphs. This is the fun thing about Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Hieroglyphs are picture writing, sure, but they can also be recreated in 3 dimensions. So hieroglyphs replicate objects, real objects, people, animals, jars, jugs, vessels, anything that you might see, you can represent in hieroglyphs within certain limits. But also objects themselves copy hieroglyphs. So here is a nice case. First of all, it's a beautiful object. It's bright blue, very attractive. It was found in the king's tomb. So it is a funerary object. It's to do with the king's transformation in the afterlife. It's not simply a memento of something he had when he was alive. Oh, we'll bury it with him so he can use it in the afterlife. Egyptologists often explain away lots of objects as objects, mementos, keepsakes that you can take with you and use in your afterlife existence. That's a bit simplistic. This need not have been something the king used, probably wasn't something the king used during life, because it's a ritual object. On one hand, it represents a vessel known in ancient Egyptian and written in hieroglyphs as hes. Hes or hesi means favor or gift or present. So the very fact that you have this is a sign that you've been given a favor, a gift, usually from the gods or the king. So it's a good thing. It's a status symbol. But because it has a little spout on it, it can write the hieroglyph with water coming out of the spout. The hieroglyph with the hes vessel, spout, and water coming out writes the word kebech. And Kebech means cool water. So if you are buried with this, perhaps it originally contained water or beer or milk or wine or something else you might want to experience in the afterlife, or something that will help you get into the afterlife. Even if it didn't contain the water, the fact that it's in the shape of the hieroglyph for cool water, we know one of the great fears the ancient Egyptians had about the afterlife was that it would be dry and arid, and things would be upside down, the world would be upturned, and you wouldn't have food, and you wouldn't have clean drinking water. By being buried with this, with several of these vessels, Tutankhamun may literally have taken some pure clean water to drink in the afterlife, but pure clean water doesn't last very long in a warm place like Egypt. The fact that it's in this rather nice vessel shaped like the hieroglyph for pure clean water means that this object is magically activated or magically valid, might say, for eternity. And so by taking this attractive, quite ergonomically pleasing object into the afterlife, Tutankhamun was assured that he would have cool water to drink for eternity. There's a more abstract religious concept as well, because it represents cool water as used in rituals. So when you worship the gods, or whether you say a prayer to your ancestors, you maybe pour the water on some offerings or on an offering table, and this magically endows them with the positive properties of the water. So there could be a more abstract meaning, as I say, or it could be something more practical, a simple assurance that by taking this and by it being preserved in Tutankhamun's tomb and used by his spirit in the afterlife, it's something eternally valued and valuable to the king for eternity. It's also just a really nice, simple form. You could tell this is ancient Egyptian because ancient Egyptian visual culture has a very standard, attractive appearance to the modern Western aesthetic, especially, in fact, when the tomb was discovered in 1922, roaring 1920s. It doesn't feel much like the roaring 20s right now, the 2020s. But in the 1920s, the objects from Tutankhamun's tomb, of course, the things covered in gold, but other objects like this is made of ceramic, a ceramic called faience, this glazed ceramic in this distinctive blue. It's just a very elegant object, and it appealed to the sensibilities of people in the 20s and still today. So that's why it attracted me in a shop. I thought, I'm not one for glitzy, blingy ephemera, but this Heset vessel or Kebech vessel really appealed to me, and that's why I have it on my shelf at home. So in answer to whoever asked, what replica objects do you have at home? That is my favourite. I have also been asked, just on a last point on the reception of ancient Egypt. Egyptology itself is an area study. It's about the study of the area of the Nile Valley in ancient times, but also in more modern times. But Egyptomania, or perhaps better put, the reception of ancient Egypt is an area of study in its own right. And we can understand a lot about ourselves, I think, by looking at reactions to Egyptian objects and ideas and artworks in the modern world for the last couple of hundred years. In fact, I've just written a book about that subject, Golden Mummies of Egypt, Interpreting Identities from the Greco-Roman Period, to be published next month by Manchester Museum and Nomad Exhibitions. Until you can get your hands on that book, I was asked, what is your recommendation for reading on reception? Now, there are lots of books about architecture, about Egyptian-inspired and Egyptianizing furniture and artwork and ephemera. But my favourite book to actually read and learn something is this by Jasmine Day. It's called The Mummy's Curse. It was published in the year 2006, and it's about representations of Egyptian mummies, what people learn about representations of Egyptian mummies in museums, in exhibitions, which is, of course, my job as a museum curator, but also in popular culture. And here is the funny thing, everyone, if I can share a bit of wisdom this week, it is that we're used to thinking that popular culture and museums are quite separate. But in fact, museums themselves influence popular culture. What you see in the Mummy movies are influenced by ideas which are established by museums about displaying mummies and other objects, statues, coffins, jewelry. These things are not necessarily about how objects were encountered by the people who discovered them, they're about how they're displayed. But here's the funny thing, museums themselves are influenced in turn by popular culture. And so when we design a museum gallery, in the past, certainly, perhaps not so much today, we are influenced by popular expectations of the mummy's tomb, the ancient Egyptian temple, everyday life in an Egyptian village. These things are created in museums based on what people expect from popular culture. So the Mummy movies have a lot to answer for. So that kind of reciprocal relationship is really interesting to dig down into if you're interested in popular culture in general and Egyptology in particular. But Jasmine Day in this book interviews a lot of visitors to museums, and she examines the really contradictory roles ancient Egyptian mummies play in fiction as well as in museums, although museums, of course, are not impartial or neutral or the absolute authority on anything. They represent whatever the curator thinks. Always remember that when you go into a museum, it's not a representation of some definitive reality. It's what the museum curator, the museum director, the museum designer thought at a given time, and fashions change. So if I was to recommend one book, The Mummy's Curse by Jasmine Day, available from all good bookshops for less than 20 British pounds. I've been asked about my attire. For these last few weeks, I've been trying to vary my wardrobe. And this week, in fact, for the first time, I'm wearing an Egyptian mummy tie. This was given to me very kindly as a gift by the great American Egyptologist Peter Lacavara, and it is from Milwaukee Museum, and it represents, although you probably can't see it, a series of coffins. The patterned silk shows the same coffin on repeat. And I can just tell, here's the fun of Egyptology, just by looking, as I was before, putting this tie on, I can tell you, looking at that reproduction on silk, that the coffin represented, it's very similar to one in Manchester Museum, currently on loan to our Golden Mummies of Egypt exhibition in the States. But this mummy, based on its style, even though it's only a few centimetres tall on the silk, I can tell you that mummy and the coffin illustrated is from the site of Akhmim, and it dates to probably the last couple of centuries BCE. So based on style, people often assume Egyptian art stays the same, stays the same, stays the same, doesn't vary. That's not true. The more art you see, the more visual culture, the more objects you look at in photographs and in museums, hopefully when things reopen, the more you start to see patterns. And having looked at a lot of ancient Egyptian coffins, I can tell you, just looking at that little bit of silk, that is definitely a coffin of the Ptolemaic period from Akhmim in Milwaukee Museum. I guess it's in Milwaukee Museum. I'll have to go and look. So, asked what my favorite piece of attire was. Amy asked me, what's your favorite Egyptian piece of clothing? Well, Amy, I've not worn it before on my broadcasts, but that tie is my favorite Egyptianizing piece. Obviously, I have other pieces of clothing which I enjoy. So I'm running out of time. In this setup, it's not quite possible to take live questions, but we're going to look at the technical wizardry of this. And for next week, I hope to take live questions from my beloved viewers. Very last question I received on Twitter was about, and it's one I've often been asked, and it's been very topical recently for various reasons. Did slaves build the pyramids? As far as we can tell, as Egyptologists, the people who built the great pyramids of Egypt, and for that matter, Sudan, were workers, either Egyptian or Sudanese workers, who were paid, who were recompensed for their work, who were housed probably on a temporary basis. They were usually likely to be farmers for most of the year, but when the river flooded annually, the annual inundation would cover the land for a few months. That would enable blocks, especially for the Great Pyramids, to be floated on the high river and taken to the site of the Royal Pyramid, the building project. And so those people, as far as we can tell, were not slaves in our understanding of slavery. That's not to say the ancient Egyptians didn't have slaves. We know there were people captured from outside Egypt who were taken by Egyptian warriors, perhaps alive, perhaps dead, we're not entirely sure in some cases. Slavery existed in some form, but the people who built the pyramids and probably other large workforces seem not to have been unduly coerced by our modern ways of thinking. It's interesting that in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, there was a theory that it was the Hebrews who built the Egyptian pyramids, although in general in Egyptology that is discredited now. We don't believe it was the Hebrews who built the pyramids, nor do we think they encoded any specific secret knowledge into the design of the pyramid. But it's a question that's often asked, and there is fairly good archaeological and textual evidence about the organization of workers across Egypt, which does not imply that the people who built the pyramids were slaves. I am happy to take any questions on our social media platforms. So on Twitter and Instagram, I am at EgyptMCR, or Google Campbell Price, Curator of Egypt and Sudan. Always happy to answer questions at any time. In lockdown, although I'm stuck, as many people are at home, we hope eventually, of course, in the next few weeks to get back into the museum, eventually to reopen to the public. But in the meantime, all the curators at the museum are very happy to answer inquiries about the collection and about the subjects we deal with. Always a pleasure to do one of these talks, broadcasts. It was a little bit scary. I'm sorry if you tuned in the wrong channel or the wrong event. We'll try and rectify that in future. But for now, I will say thank you very much to those people who have joined in. Join me next week at 3 p.m. when I'll be answering more questions, perhaps a different theme about ancient Egypt. Stay well, keep safe, and see you next